Brad, tell us about the first few days of working on the idea and the screenplay for Frank the Bastard.
Yeah, well, I think the dawn of the story came to me when I went up to Washington County, Maine for the first time. I mean, I grew up in New England, all different parts of New England, but Washington County, Maine was the wild, wild east. It's a really primal kind of landscape. And I was up there teaching a sixth grade class of Passamaquoddy Indians, a filmmaking workshop. I brought a bunch of actors and filmmakers up to work one-on-one with the kids, and they were all making their little own movies. And I was surrounded by this crazy world with the Vietnam veterans. You know, like the first time I was driving into the town, I was lost. It was foggy at night. It was like Claire and Isolde arriving, and I pulled in this porch of the house, and I see this old woman looking down through the fog, and I go, "Excuse me, I'm looking for Lubec, Maine." And she goes, "Ye be from here, ye be from away." Like in that kind of wild, it's not even Middle English, it's a variant of Old English that is still spoken in parts of Washington County. It's really something else up there with the Pentecostal churches, and the Cyrus Gast is based on probably Maine's greatest sort of underclass criminal figure who ran all sorts of different scams up there, real estate and toxic waste disposal, and so a lot of the characters in the story are based on real life figures that I researched when I was up there. But I think there was that world that I fell into. At the same time, I think in my internal world, I was going through something of a midlife crisis in terms of trying to come to terms with things that had happened to me when I was young, coming of age during the 60s. I come from a somewhat fractured and dysfunctional family full of a lot of, addiction and mental illness and like divorces and crazy stuff. But I'd always been sort of buoyed by the 60s was a great coming of age during that the music, and as a young man coming to New York, and the theater, and the I felt, wow, there's hope and salvation in the arts, and storytelling in particular was what drew me. And I grew up, reading a lot of literature and a lot of, old time. I consider it old time now as fiction. I loved Southern Gothic fiction. I loved Russian novels. I loved where deep, dense storytelling was very character driven and very like something that I had felt had gone out of movie making. And when I first decided to become a filmmaker, it was sort of for me to let go of wanting to become a fiction writer, which is what I initially wanted to do when I was really young, and gravitate toward movies, was that right at that particular point in my life, I watched movies like The Godfather and Chinatown, that early 70s stuff was just like mind-bending in terms of like, wow, these are the new novelists, these are the new storytellers. They're able to use the screen as a way to get that kind of incredible story density that speaks to the modern age. And even though they're about old, both those films are about looking back on historical periods, and I was very encouraged by the possibility of being able to do that. And like a lot of my life, it became a rather steady disappointment. And I felt at the time that I decided to make Frank the Bastard, that indie filmmaking had sort of, first of all, given up in terms of trying to tell the big stories, the epic stories. They relinquished that to Hollywood, and that indie films were sort of steadily shrinking. And this is sort of the dawn of like mumblecore and stuff where like I was just like, I don't think that's, as a storyteller, what I'm good at and what I want to do. So I'll take this one shot at telling a very indie movie, but make it feel like it has an epic scale in terms of characters, the cast, the size of the cast, the characters, the scope of the time, past and present are all heavily explored, and also being a journey film, kind of an epic journey for her, Claire, descending really. When you first see her, she's at the top of the Manhattan, and then she literally plummets into this world. And I wanted to get those themes and those storytelling tropes all into this small, relatively low-budget indie film. So it was a big challenge.
Right. Well, Brad, I understand from your bio that you maybe still are or were a script doctor.
Yep.
So from the mindset of a script doctor, how did you start the screenplay for Frank the Bastard? Like, what were your beginning stages? I realized you had a lot of things you wanted to put into a story, and very rich sort of, I know you referenced Stephen King in the movie, and this fiction sort of that place, and how almost untouched by time it seemed. But in terms of the actual structure and how you started it, what do you remember the first day you actually said, "No, I'm going to write this story," or how did it begin?
Well, like I said, I think it started with finding that location and going, "Wow, this is an opportunity." Like in the way that, like, when John Ford first stumbled onto Monument Valley, he was like, "Oh wow, I could tell a lot of stories here. This place just screams out a certain type of narrative," and I felt that way about Washington County. I also had at the time a relative of mine who was going through a bout of mental illness, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and so I was immersed in that. I saw a lot of things from my own family history that came out. I worked on the screenplay a long time. I really developed it like it was a novel almost. It started with a lot more story, and I just kept distilling it down, which is why it feels like it has this certain density. As a friend of mine says, in the era of wine coolers, you've created a single malt whiskey. It's like pure, like, oh my God, it's so intense. So that distillation process took a long time. And it was also a bit of a stretch for me to write a movie about a woman protagonist. I think at that point in my life, I was letting go of being a young male, and I was more in touch with, I was getting ready to start a family, and I needed to, and fittingly, I had a daughter. That's my one child is a woman now, or a young woman. I felt a need to bridge the gap between I was probably a fairly masculine type of young man, and kind of obtuse in the way that implies, as you might know, being a woman. And so it was really great for me to explore, a character who starts off, not only is she a woman, but she's also very vulnerable and kind of damaged. And
the panic attacks.
I think that was a part of myself that I needed to bring out, my own damaged self, which I think up to that point in my life, I wasn't comfortable with that. So it was nice to find a protagonist who could be that for me.
Well, and you do reference Stephen King, and I know in his book on writing, he talks about writing a script and then leaving it in a drawer for a little bit.
Yeah.
So for yourself as a script doctor or former script doctor, are you able to, quote, leave it in a drawer for a little bit and then come back and see it from that critical mindset, or are you too close to the material?
No, I was able to do that. There was just enough distance in this story. And I did it a number of times. I think I did 7 or 8 drafts of this screenplay over a 4-year period. So I definitely let it sit and let it, just like old whiskey. Like it got better, I think. Or it certainly got more intense. It's like, absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Switching gears a little bit, where did you go for financing for Frank the Bastard? I mean, and I know it had a different title. It was...
Well, the original title was actually Frank the Bastard.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah. I was talked into changing the title by my producer's rep, who felt like the movie was so intense that it didn't need a super intense title. And also that there was a certain... Would people understand there's a certain irony about the title, in that the film is basically Claire's story. And that Frank the Bastard is not only a spin on the Gothic romance novels that her friend Isolde that's her trade, but that Frank the Bastard is also somewhat of there's a reference there using the word frank, or truth, frankness, truthfulness being a mixture of things, not being there not being a single path in life, and I think he just felt that was way too literary, and people wouldn't get that, and we should give the film a very accessible title. And east of Acadia is a region in Maine, and so I went with that initially, and then thank God enough people said to me, "Are you crazy? That title was great, and you got to keep it." So it came back by popular demand. But
so the financing, how did you secure financing for the film? You had the screenplay, You had the
Well,
location.
yeah, and we had also Massachusetts film tax credit, which was huge. At that point it was 35%. I mean, it was really, there's just no way we could have shot that film in Maine, which had no film tax credit, which is why we didn't. It's that everything you see in the movie was shot on the coast of Massachusetts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So we were able to secure financing by, with the film tax credit. I because I had been working on the film for so long. It was my second film, but my first film was extremely low budget, and it actually made me some money, miraculously enough. And I had established enough credibility with a group of investors, mostly in New York and in the banking world. It took a long time to raise the money. It was sort of an endless and very frustrating series of things. But I didn't make anything else. That's why it took me so long to make a second film, is that I put all my eggs in one basket, so to speak. And yeah. I mean, I learned, first of all, patience, because it's the hardest thing in the world when you've been taken on a career in an art form that does take so long. I mean, and so many things are out of your control in terms of, a painter has a canvas and a brush, and a writer has a pen and a paper or a computer now. But filmmakers are completely at the mercy of a huge, which I both love and hate. I love working with people, and I have some background in theater, so I was prepared a little bit for filmmaking by working a lot in theater, which is as similar as a microcosm of film, where you definitely need a group, and you need a network of other creative people too. But it's a lot easier to make a play than it is to make a movie, and in terms of just the logistics of it. So that prepared me, but I guess I learned I'd rather do one thing really true to my ambition and try and do it as well as I can, rather than do, like, I could have directed a couple of commercials, and during that period I was offered other things that felt like would have been fine, career moves, but I didn't. I stuck with this thing through hell and high water, and which is what it took, because this film was so hard to make. In terms of for an indie film, has a fairly epic scale of storytelling and production, and so that's also taught me focus, to stay focused over a long period of time. That was hard, but yeah.
So you had your first film, is it The Undeserved?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay, and that was through IFC.
Yeah.
And then did it sort of change your mindset where you say, I'm not just a writer, director, I'm not just a filmmaker and an artist, so to speak, but I'm also a small business owner? Did you ever think in that?
Yeah, you have to. I mean, I kept trying to keep my eye on, and the problem is for filmmakers, it is just, it's like being a musician back in the 80s, when the bottom dropped out and the whole landscape changed. That had nothing to do with individual art or even business savvy. It's just that the model fell apart. The business model fell apart. And that's what's happened to indie filmmakers. I mean, when I moved to San Francisco, the first week I was there, Steven Soderbergh's going to give a speech at the San Francisco Film Center. I'll go down there. He got up in front of 600 people and said, I'm out of here. I can't do this anymore. The whole thing is, and I remember the conviction that he said, whatever period of time, and in some ways he was an interesting figure, because I think he ushered in the kind of the great sunrise of independent film production. I remember first seeing Sex, Lies, and Videotape and going, wow, like, this is a really interesting, thing that's happening in filmmaking, where one guy, a very singular vision, a very idiosyncratic film, could reach this massive audience because it was just so specifically good and character driven, and it turned out to be a little bit of a red herring. I think there was many independent films that came out after that were great, but that there might be a viable way to make independent films in this country that are going to reach an audience like that, and for him to get up and say, I'm done, I can't do this anymore, was like shocking to me, and not shocking really, but it was sort of like, oh no. everything that I'm feeling about the independent film world is true. The daunting difficulty of it all, and the fact that it's, you know, like if you're, you know, you were a musician in the 80s and you'd been making your, you know, your living off of selling CDs, and you better figure out a new plan immediately.
Yeah.
And that's what it, you know. So the film itself is something of a throwback in terms of the style, and, you know, and I think that the genre itself, I don't think big indie, and that's another thing I was like, maybe this is the last chance to make a really big, a true big indie film. I had the capability of doing it. I thought I had the story, I had the setting, I had the, you know, I'll just take this one last crack and, you know, see what happens. So in that way, you know, there wasn't, you know, I don't think it was the savviest business move, but I think that there was unique reasons to try and make this film. Yeah.
When you're writing conflict, because I know there's many scenes in the film where there's intense conflict, are you writing sort of an outline, a structure for it, and then once you get with the actors, you give them more room to put more fire into those scenes, or are you writing the intensity of the anger in the screenplay?
Well, I think with this screenplay, you know, because it had been, you know, developed, you know, it was I thought extremely already so intense, and very different working on this screenplay than working on The Undeserved, you know, my first film, which was, you know, very much a Mike Leigh inspired, where when I started making that movie, I did not have a screenplay. I dropped a bunch of actors into a small town in Vermont, and the town became the blank canvas, and we developed that story through improvisation and actors running around the town figuring out who was who, and it was just a really interesting process and my background had been as a screenwriter. Again, not the savviest business decision in the world in terms of like, why was I was going against maybe my strength and my training, but I felt something very vital about that for that particular film and doing it that way. And I still think Mike Leigh is, you know, in terms of guys who, you know, greatest living indie filmmaker, I put him up there against anyone. And but this film, I had the screenplay, and I didn't have a lot of time, you know, to work with the actors in that way. Thank God I had actors who were very script savvy and didn't really need a lot of prompting. You don't have to tell William Sadler where the conflict in a scene is, you know. And you know, and people like Chris Sarandon, you know, they're just such a literary sensibility anyway. He was helping me with other characters, not just his own character.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a lot of nice, and Rachel Miner, again, same thing, just a deep insight into the nuances of the script. So we didn't, you know, not only we did not have the time, but even if I had, I don't know if I would have said much more than I had to say during production. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How close were you to actually not making this film?
Yeah, real close. There was a couple of, you know, there was a point 2 years before when we were going to go up and shoot it, and we had most of the financing in place, but you know, Massachusetts had a smaller film tax credit, and we felt too stretched thin, and I wasn't 100% sure that I could pull it off, you know. So again, what I learned was patience and just when to make your move. But yeah, it was a fraught journey for sure. It's like Claire's journey. It was like, you know, it was the quote by Nietzsche: "Twisted is the path to eternity." It's like.
Very true, yeah. Or the one I like too is Coppola. I think anything that you build with love invites chaos.
Yeah.
Something to that
that's
effect.
a good one,
yeah.
yeah.
Tips to other filmmakers on keeping in communication with their financiers, with the people that are. I'm sure most of those people are very on point, very specific, you know, with things, and I'm sure communication is probably the number one thing. But anything that you've learned along the way? You said you've dealt with all these people, most of them were in the banking sector.
Yeah, you know, which is like you're talking to people who don't quite know what you're talking about, and you don't know what they're talking about. You know, when they're telling you that, like, you know, there's always that. You know, I would say patience and also I think ultimately what it comes down to when you're talking to investors, they know that it's a crapshoot and they know that it's ridiculously. I think, you know, what people respond to, even in the business world, more intensely than making money or making something successful is that they respond to authenticity. They respond to something that they feel is coming from a very deep place in someone. And I think that I was always able to convey that there was a certain, this story was coming out of me in a profound way. It was a story I very much needed to tell. And I think at the end of the day, they sensed that, or most of them did, because there were people who dropped out who were like, too crazy. This whole adventure seems like, for sure, you run into, for every person that you're able to convince and to reach, there's someone who's like, it's too daunting. It's the gap between the business world and the artistic world. The artistic world is often, it's not just, it's chaos and it's turmoil and it's interiority. It's about, things that are going on the inside, which are often very hard to articulate, and also to get people to relate. I think Frank the Bastard is like, it's unique because it's such a leap into this other world, and to take a Wall Street banker on that journey was like, a challenge.
Would you say you approach many things in life, and forgive me if I'm getting too personal, but because you mentioned that things had been sort of a winding journey, and you've dealt with certain things in your life, that maybe that's just a product. You've become a product of that,
Sure.
And it's very important to you
Sure.
to make sure that you have the right reasons driving you, and not just.
Yeah. Sure. I've always asked myself that question: is something that's just, is it specific to me? Is a certain? I mean, I once referred to my brother and I as children of chaos. That it was the children of the flower children begat the children of chaos. In terms of, we came out of that, exciting, tumultuous. All my distant memories of the 1960s are just like, I just could not believe seeing Jimi Hendrix, perform when I was 9 years old. It was like crazy. It was like, I was like, these are gods. This is not just personal gods, rock stars. This is a new type of energy coming into the universe. And I was like, I don't know how many people can relate to that. I mean, I can, or the disappointment of having that not really come to much, that very soon after the 60s, Richard Nixon would get elected, and then Ronald Reagan would come along, and then if you're dreaming, be prepared to be crushed. Now that may be part of my personal experience, but I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that's a very human thing to dream and to hope for wholeness and for a fallen world to be restored is, I think, a very, it's biblical. It's in a lot of religions, and but yeah, I can never really fully answer that question, but I try all the time.
Sure. Well, everyone can probably think of all the negatives of coming from chaos, but what are the positives of coming from it? Because I'm sure there's many things that we wouldn't think of.
Yeah, I mean,
Result from that.
For me, is that I find that I can go anywhere in the world. I mean, I'm making a film now down in the city of San Pedro Sula, Honduras, which is currently probably the most chaotic spot on the planet. It's the murder capital of the world. It's like a place in total freefall. And I can go into a city like that and feel pretty comfortable and dialed in and reaching out to a population. It's a film about the only girls' orphanage in Honduras, and it's about them trying to learn how to write poetry. And it was like, I just fell right in. It was like instantly connected to, and I think the way that the world is going right now, I think being something of a chaos manager is a good life skill. I think the thing that I try and not do is succumb to a certain kind of emotional, that there was certain things that are particular to my sadness or my pain or my trauma that's really specifically mine, and that to somehow be able to have that, and to feel, always to make that a part of, not try and hide that or bury that, because I think that's a very common tendency, but to balance it with what's going on out in the world it's an ongoing struggle. But I think it is a skill. I think it is something that I'm pretty good at, and hopefully we'll find ways to use it, because it's you know, it's something of a you know, it's not like I'm a great entertainer, or you know, I don't have you know, I'm drawn to certain pockets of the world that are most people might shy away from, and I don't necessarily think that's always, you know, a great thing, but it has its uses. I'll say that, yeah.